A ruthless CEO's world of cold efficiency is upended by a single thoughtless act. He fires a janitor for the seemingly trivial offense of reading a book on company time, believing he is simply eliminating a liability. Little does he know that the man he just dismissed is the best-selling author of that very book, a fact that will send the CEO's life into a tailspin and force him to confront the limits of his own ruthless ambition. This story tells how a CEO fired a janitor for reading a book and, upon discovering that the janitor was the author, experiences regret and ultimately throws himself before the people. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. Julian Thorne's world was a fortress of glass and steel, a citadel of ambition built on the relentless churn of data and the promise of endless innovation. His penthouse, perched atop the very skyscraper that housed the global headquarters of his tech empire, Innovate Global, was less a home and more a command center. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, glittering mosaic of a city he saw not as a collection of lives, but as a vast, untapped market. Every object in his apartment, from the minimalist custom-made furniture to the single abstract sculpture that dominated his living room, was a deliberate statement of efficiency and ruthless success. At 38, he was a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with disruptor. He lived by a creed of perpetual motion. Idle hands, in his view, were not just the devil's playground, they were a corporate liability. This philosophy extended to every aspect of his life. He ate quick, nutrient-dense meals prepared by a private chef who knew better than to interrupt his work. His social calendar was a finely tuned instrument for networking and deal-making. He saw every moment as an opportunity to build, to expand, to conquer. This night, like countless others, he was a restless sentinel over his kingdom. A flicker of dissatisfaction, a single errant line in a quarterly report on his tablet, had driven him from his bed at 2 a.m. He was a man who lived to solve problems, even when those problems were little more than minor anomalies in a sea of overwhelming success. Julian's impatience was a well-honed weapon. He didn't just walk, he strode with a purpose that seemed to vibrate with kinetic energy. His mind, a complex web of algorithms and market trends, was incapable of slowing down. He often walked the deserted hallways of his building in the early hours, a ghost in the machine, to satisfy himself that his fortress was operating at peak efficiency, even when no one was around. It was during one of these nocturnal inspections that he first saw him. The janitor. Down on the 54th floor, in a quiet wing dedicated to research and development, a single light shone from a small break room. Julian, his brow furrowed in annoyance, pushed the heavy glass door open. He expected to find a misplaced piece of cleaning equipment, a spill, some minute detail that had been overlooked. Instead, he found a man seated in a cheap plastic chair, his mop and bucket resting obediently against the wall, a single well-worn book cradled in his hands. This was Marcus Vance. At 45, Marcus inhabited a world defined not by ambition but by peace. He was the quiet hum in the symphony of the city, the steady pulse of a building that slept while others worked. His movements were methodical, a practiced ballet of sweeping and wiping that left no corner untouched, no speck of dust unseen. The cleaning uniform he wore was a canvas for his quiet dignity. Unlike Julian, whose life was a series of scheduled appointments, Marcus's routine was one of simple rhythms. His days began when Julian's ended, and he found a profound, contemplative pleasure in the stillness of the late hours. For Marcus, the quiet of the office after midnight was more than just a workspace, it was a sanctuary. The cubicles, once buzzing with the frantic energy of 1,000 lives, were now silent monuments to the work of the day. He saw the world from a different perspective, through a lens of reflection. While Julian's gaze was fixed on the city below, on the future he intended to create, Marcus's was often turned inward, toward the intricate landscapes of his own imagination. His true life, the one that gave his soul breath, was not in the cleaning supply closet, but on the pages of a book. Marcus was a writer, a fact known to almost no one. His pen name, Vance, was a quiet nod to his love for all things academic and literary, a life he had once pursued before the sudden collapse of his family's finances forced him onto a different path. He wrote because he had to. His words were a river and he was the vessel. His genre of choice was a complex, philosophical science fiction that explored the nature of consciousness and the human condition. His first novel, Chronicles of the Event Horizon, had been a surprise smash hit, a book that had captivated critics and readers alike with its profound insights and breathtaking narrative scope. He wrote under a pseudonym to maintain a clear separation between his two lives, a public identity as a best-selling author and a private one as the humble janitor who took solace in the silence of his work. The book in his hands now was his own. A fresh, first-edition copy of Chronicles of the Event Horizon that he had bought for himself as a small indulgence. He was rereading it, not out of vanity, but out of a deep-seated need to connect with the characters he had spent years creating, to revisit the world he had poured his heart and soul into. As Julian watched him from the doorway, Marcus was lost in a different universe, one of his own making. The words on the page were a balm to his spirit, a reminder that his existence was more than just the sum of his labor. Julian, however, saw none of this. He saw only a man shirking his duties. His mind, trained for decades to calculate risk and reward, immediately processed the scene before him as a gross inefficiency. The mop was idle. The man was stationary. Time, precious and finite, was being wasted on a frivolous pursuit. He saw the book as a symbol of laziness, a distraction from the fundamental contract between employer and employee, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. The fact that the man was reading on company time in his building struck Julian as a personal affront. It was a disruption to the perfect order he had built. Julian's jaw tightened. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. The fury that churned within him was a cold, quiet storm. He wasn't a man given to grand gestures or public displays of anger. His power lay in quiet, decisive action. He simply turned, his footsteps silent on the polished floor, and retreated into the night. His mind had already made a judgment, a swift and unforgiving calculation. The janitor was a liability, a drain on the system, and a symbol of everything he despised. Marcus, completely oblivious to the brief, seething presence of his CO, continued to read. The world of his novel enveloped him, a warm and familiar blanket against the cool efficiency of the building. The words on the page shimmered with a life of their own, and for a moment he was no longer a janitor, but the architect of galaxies, the cartographer of the human heart. He turned a page, a soft, satisfied smile playing on his lips, unaware that his peaceful moment had set in motion a chain of events that would upend both his life and Julian Thorne's. The memory of the janitor, a fleeting annoyance in the grand scheme of his day, had already been filed away in the far corners of Julian Thorne's mind. He had sent a single terse email to his head of facilities at 3 a.m. that morning, a missive that carried the weight of a royal decree: review and terminate any cleaning staff found derelict in their duties. Zero tolerance for inefficiency. The subject was now closed. His mind had moved on to what he called leisure, a concept that, for him, was indistinguishable from a change of scenery for his work. He was preparing for his annual work retreat, a 7-day excursion to a private island resort in the Caribbean, a place where billionaires gathered not to relax, but to forge alliances and ink multi-million-dollar deals over sunset cocktails. Julian's preparation was a masterclass in strategic precision. He didn't pack. His assistant, a young woman named Clara who had learned to anticipate his every need, handled that. His closet was a minimalist monument to success, a stark collection of perfectly tailored suits, crisp white shirts and dark polo shirts that served as his casual uniform. His itinerary, a meticulously detailed document of his own creation, was not filled with spa appointments or snorkeling trips. Instead, it was a chronological list of power breakfasts, golf course negotiations, and discreet dinners with venture capitalists and foreign dignitaries. The island's stunning natural beauty was merely the backdrop for his performance, a stage on which he would demonstrate his ceaseless drive and unparalleled acumen. He was bringing his work not as a burden, but as his constant companion and source of joy. The day before his flight, Julian stood in his living room, a space that felt more like a gallery than a personal sanctuary, and reviewed the final details on his tablet. He had just finished a video conference with a team in Tokyo, and another was scheduled with Berlin in 4 hours. He was a man in perpetual motion, a shark that would die if it stopped swimming. The concept of simply being was foreign to him, anathema to his very nature. To be still was to be unproductive, and to be unproductive was to be a failure. He had built his empire on this principle, and he believed it was the only true path to greatness. His mind briefly flickered back to the janitor and the book. he felt a familiar surge of cold contempt. He saw himself as a man who commanded the tides of technology and capital, while the janitor was a man who scrubbed floors and read books for idle pleasure. It was a simple, brutal equation for Julian. One was a creator, the other a consumer. And in his world, consumers were liabilities. He dismissed the thought and refocused on the market data, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced speed, a predator in his element, preparing for the hunt. In a small two-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, Marcus Vance was preparing for his own journey, a world away in every sense. His apartment was a testament to a life lived with a different kind of richness. The furniture was comfortable and worn, a mosaic of found pieces and hand-me-downs. The walls were lined not with modern art, but with bookshelves overflowing with a lifetime of literary adventures. The air was filled with the scent of old paper and the subtle aroma of a fresh cup of coffee, a simple pleasure he savored every morning. Marcus was not packing for a networking event. He was packing for silence, for solitude, for a deep and meaningful conversation with himself. His journey was a pilgrimage of the spirit. He was going to a small guest house on a remote island, a place where the internet was spotty, the nearest town was miles away, and the only agenda was the rise and fall of the tides. His bag was light, a few worn t-shirts, a pair of shorts, a good sun hat, and most importantly a stack of books. One of them, a fresh, unblemished copy, was his new novel, The Astral Mariner, a sequel to the first book that had been published just 2 weeks ago to even greater critical acclaim. He had decided to take a full week off. This was a rare indulgence for him. His writing, his true passion, was usually relegated to the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, after he had finished his shift. The exhaustion was a constant companion, but the words were a fire that kept him warm. He had saved for months to afford this trip, a reward he felt he had earned for the long nights, the early mornings, and the sheer effort of balancing two disparate lives. He was a man of routines, of simple pleasures, but this trip was a deliberate break from that routine, a chance to recharge the well of his creativity. As he folded a faded t-shirt, his mind drifted to his latest book. He had poured everything into it, the culmination of years of quiet, meticulous work. The themes were more complex, the characters more nuanced. He was excited to read it in a different context, to see his own words with fresh eyes, to be a reader again and not just the author. He was a humble man, and the success he had found was a constant source of quiet amazement. He had never sought fame or fortune, only an audience for the stories that lived within him. His peaceful preparations were momentarily disrupted by a text message from his mother. She was checking in on him, reminding him to pack sunscreen. Marcus smiled warmly. His family, his small circle of close friends, they were his true wealth. He wasn't defined by his job or his achievements. He was defined by his connections, his compassion, and his quiet resilience. The next day, as Julian Thorne's private jet roared to life, Marcus Vance boarded a small regional plane, his duffel bag stowed neatly in the overhead compartment. They were both headed to the same tiny, beautiful island. One on a pilgrimage for profit, the other on a quest for peace. The irony was lost on both of them. One man was oblivious to the quiet dignity of the other, and the other was blissfully unaware of the cold, impersonal judgment that had been passed on him. They were two parallel lines, unknowingly converging on a single shared horizon, a collision course set not by fate, but by a simple, ill-judged moment in the quiet of the night. The stage was set, the characters were in motion, and the true test of their characters was about to begin, far from the polished floors of Julian's empire and the tranquil solace of Marcus's sanctuary. Julian Thorne stepped off the seaplane and onto the manicured deck of the resort's private marina, the air thick with the scent of salt and tropical blooms. He was instantly enveloped in a world of muted luxury, where every detail was curated to perfection. The resort, with its infinity pools blending into the sapphire ocean and its sleek, open-air cabanas, was a testament to the fact that money could indeed buy peace, or at least, a highly sanitized, aesthetically pleasing version of it. For Julian, it was a perfectly constructed environment for what he considered an intellectual safari. His phone, which he held in his hand like a modern-day scepter, was already pinging with notifications. He was a predator in a pristine habitat, and he was here to hunt. The first 2 days were a blur of strategic encounters. A power breakfast with a Dubai-based investor on a terrace overlooking the sea. A round of golf with a European energy mogul where the real score was not the number of strokes, but the size of the future contracts. A late-night summit in a private lounge with a team of legal advisors, finalizing a major acquisition. Julian was in his element, a master of his domain, the king of a jungle where the only currency was power. He saw the resort's other guests as either potential partners or inconsequential background noise. His mind, a finely tuned machine, was incapable of slowing down even here. He never once looked at the ocean with a sense of wonder. He only saw it as a massive, beautiful commodity that validated the price of his stay. On the third day, a rare and fleeting moment of respite found him. A minor deal had been unexpectedly delayed, leaving him with a 3-hour window of unscheduled time. The very concept of empty time was anathema to him, a void he was accustomed to filling with purpose. He decided to take a walk, not for leisure but for a change of pace to clear his head. He chose the most secluded path, a winding trail that led to a small hidden beach known only to the resort's most discerning guests. The sand was soft and white, the water a gentle, lapping turquoise. It was a picture of serene perfection, a place designed for quiet contemplation. And there, sitting on a weathered wooden bench beneath a swaying palm tree, was a man. Julian recognized him instantly, a flash of cold contempt cutting through his momentary calm. It was the janitor. The man from the 54th floor, the one whose indolent book-reading presence had offended Julian's very sensibilities. Julian's mind, a rapid-fire calculator of perceived transgressions, went to work. How could this be? The audacity of it all. He had seen the man wasting time in his building, and now, here he was on a vacation that Julian's company, and by extension he himself, had indirectly provided the means for. The thought was infuriating. The man was a symbol of everything Julian had spent his life fighting against: mediocrity, idleness, and a lack of ambition. The email he had sent before leaving the city flashed in his mind, and a cold satisfaction settled over him. Unbeknownst to Julian, Marcus Vance was having the most tranquil day of his life. He had woken with the sun, taken a long, leisurely walk along the shoreline, and settled into his favorite spot on the secluded beach. He had spent the morning working on his next novel, the words flowing like a river. He had just stopped to give himself a break, pulling out the fresh copy of his newest release, The Astral Mariner, to reread a chapter that he felt was particularly strong. He was deeply immersed in the world he had created, the gentle rhythm of the waves a natural soundtrack to his thoughts. The book was a mirror, reflecting his deepest passions and intellectual curiosity. It was a tangible piece of his soul, and he was filled with a sense of quiet contentment that Julian Thorne would never be able to comprehend. Marcus was so lost in his world that he didn't notice the approaching figure until he felt a shadow fall over his page. He looked up, his peaceful expression giving way to one of polite confusion. The man standing before him was a stranger, yet there was something about the sharp, expensive lines of his suit and the hard set of his jaw that commanded attention. Julian Thorne. The man from the office. Marcus's mind reeled, trying to place the face in a context he couldn't quite grasp. Why was the CEO of Innovate Global standing in front of him, on this tiny remote island? "Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice a low, hard-edged baritone that cut through the soft sound of the waves. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "I believe we've met. Or more accurately, I've seen you. On the 54th floor. In a break room. Reading." Marcus's face, which had been a mask of confusion, now shifted to one of quiet shock. He couldn't speak. The suddenness of the confrontation, the sheer unprovoked coldness of it, took his breath away. Julian continued, his words delivered with the finality of a court judgment. "I'm a man who believes in a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. I don't tolerate idleness. I don't tolerate shirking of duties. When I saw you, I made a decision. Your employment with Innovate Global has been terminated. Effective immediately." Marcus finally found his voice, a whisper of disbelief. I was on a break. It was a few minutes. I wasn't shirking my duties." "On a break from what, exactly?" Julian asked, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "It seems your idea of a break is a private, tropical vacation that my company has paid for. The irony is not lost on me, Mr. Vance." Marcus's heart sank. He tried to explain, to tell Julian that he had paid for this trip himself, that his work as a janitor was a means to an end, a way to support his true passion, but the words caught in his throat. Julian wasn't listening. he had already made his judgment. He saw a man who had taken advantage of his system, a man who, in Julian's cold, transactional world, was a liability to be eliminated. The book, still in Marcus's hands, was a silent witness to Julian's contempt. Julian saw the object itself, a symbol of what he considered a wasteful use of time, but he never bothered to look at the title. "Consider this a lesson, Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice dropping to a final, definitive tone. "Hard work is a virtue. Laziness is a disease. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a world to run." With that, Julian Thorne turned and strode back down the path, leaving Marcus sitting alone, the salty breeze carrying the sharp, painful echo of his words. The book in Marcus's hand felt heavy, a sudden, meaningless weight. His peaceful sanctuary had been invaded, and his life, for the first time in a very long time, had been truly and completely upended. He was left with a single devastating thought. What did he do now? The confrontation was over, but the story had just begun. The reveal, the truth about the book, and the fallout of Julian's impulsive decision was all still to come. The world was about to shift beneath Julian's feet, and he had no idea what was waiting for him. Julian Thorne's stride back from the beach was as purposeful as his approach had been. He felt a deep, chilling sense of satisfaction. The encounter had been a reaffirmation of his core beliefs. He had identified a problem, an employee who embodied a lack of ambition, and had surgically removed it. The world, in his mind, was a better, more efficient place for it. He didn't waste another thought on the janitor. The man was a ghost, a blip on the radar of his career, already fading into the digital history of a terminated contract. Julian's focus was, as always, on the horizon. He was due for a lunch meeting with a man named David Sterling, a powerful and reclusive figure in the world of venture capital, known for his almost mythical ability to spot disruptive talent before anyone else. This meeting was the reason Julian had come to the island, and nothing, especially not the dismissal of a minor employee, would distract him from it. The lunch took place in a sun-drenched private dining room overlooking the lagoon. Julian, sharp and impeccable in a light linen suit, was at his most charming. He was a master conversationalist when he chose to be, a man who could speak with profound authority on everything from global market trends to the subtle nuances of blockchain technology. He felt he was playing a high-stakes chess match, and he was already several moves ahead. David Sterling, a man in his 60s with a quiet, observant demeanor, listened more than he spoke. He was a legend, and Julian felt the weight of the opportunity, his mind already calculating the next phase of his company's growth. They had been discussing a potential investment into Innovate Global's next-generation AI project, a venture that promised to revolutionize the healthcare industry. Julian was in the middle of a powerful, impassioned monologue about the future of human-machine interaction, when David Sterling, in a moment of polite but firm interruption, held up a hand. "Julian, forgive me," David said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "I'm a man who believes in looking at the whole picture, not just the numbers. I've been following your work for some time, and it's clear you're a brilliant mind. But I'm also a man who believes in the heart and soul of a company. The people. The vision. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? It's the difference between a brilliant idea and a brilliant story." Julian, caught off guard, nodded, his mind racing to adapt. "Of course. Story is everything. It's how we connect with our users, how we build trust." "Exactly," David said, a subtle, knowing smile on his lips. "And speaking of story, have you read A.L. Vance's new novel? The Astral Mariner? It's a masterpiece, a true work of genius." Julian's perfectly composed facade wavered for a fraction of a second. The name A.L. Vance was vaguely familiar. It was a name that had been popping up in his news feeds, on tech blogs, in the conversations of his more literary-minded friends. A celebrated author. But the name didn't register fully. His mind was still on the AI project, on the numbers, on the future of his company. "I haven't had the pleasure," Julian replied, the words a polite, almost dismissive formality. He was already preparing to pivot the conversation back to business. "My reading is mostly limited to market analysis and research papers." "Ah, but this is different," David said, a genuine passion lighting his eyes. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a book, its cover a beautiful, swirling nebula of blues and purples. It was a pristine, new hardcover copy. Julian's eyes fell on the title, The Astral Mariner. The words hit him like a physical blow. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The title. The book. The very same book he had seen just hours ago, clutched in the hands of the man he had just fired. No, it couldn't be. It had to be a coincidence. The title was a popular one. The universe was a vast and random place. It's about the nature of consciousness, our place in the universe, David continued, oblivious to Julian's internal turmoil. The author Vance, it's just incredible. He's a true visionary. The way he talks about the human condition is just profound. He flipped the book over to the back cover, and his finger pointed to a small, unassuming biography. Did you know he worked as a janitor? He wrote for years in the early mornings before his shift. He was a janitor at Innovate Global, your company, I believe. It was a fascinating little tidbit I read in his last interview. Julian's blood ran cold. The private dining room, with its hushed elegance and stunning view, suddenly felt like a suffocating cage. He felt a wave of nausea. The words janitor, Innovate Global, the Astral Mariner, all collided in his mind, a catastrophic storm of realization. The man he had just dismissed, the man he had judged as lazy and without ambition, was a literary titan. A genius. The author of a book his potential investor considered a masterpiece. A book he had just seen on the beach. He had fired a man for reading his own work. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Julian's face, which had been a mask of confident authority, was now a portrait of absolute horror. He was a man who lived by logic and data, and yet, the universe had just presented him with a brutal, unforgiving piece of poetry. The irony was a dagger to the heart of his entire worldview. He had seen a man reading and had, in his ruthless and cold efficiency, condemned him. He had seen a man with a rich, internal life and had reduced him to a liability. David Sterling, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, looked at Julian with a puzzled expression. Julian? Are you all right? Julian could only stare at the book, at the name on the cover, at the words the Astral Mariner. He thought of the quiet dignity on Marcus's face as he sat on the bench, and the pain in his eyes when Julian had delivered his verdict. He thought of the email he had sent, a single, thoughtless act that had set this catastrophe in motion. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a sin against the very concept of human potential. He had looked at the world through a lens of brutal utility and had been blind to the extraordinary. I'm not feeling well, Julian stammered, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. He pushed his chair back, the screech of wood on tile a jarring sound in the quiet room. I need to make a call. He stood and walked away, not even bothering to apologize. He was a man who had been running 100 miles an hour and he had just hit a wall. His entire system, his entire belief structure, had just been fatally compromised. He was the most powerful man in the room, and yet he felt more powerless than he had ever felt in his life. The world was no longer a perfectly ordered fortress of glass and steel. It was a vast and complex ocean, and he had just been humbled by a single, quiet wave. Julian's retreat from the lunch meeting was not a flight, but a tactical withdrawal. He had not walked away from a negotiation, but from a catastrophic miscalculation. The private dining room, with its stunning view of the lagoon, had transformed into a crime scene, and he was the sole perpetrator. He found his way back to his secluded villa, his mind a maelstrom of regret and growing panic. He had to find Marcus Vance. Immediately. He had to apologize, to explain, to what? To offer his old job back? That felt pitifully small, a hollow gesture for a man who was already a star in a universe Julian couldn't even begin to comprehend. He tried to think logically, to use the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business dealings. First, he needed to locate Marcus. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he typed a single email to his assistant, Clara. Find the full name and room number of the janitor terminated this morning. Urgently. Do not ask questions. Clara, a woman who had mastered the art of silent, efficient execution, responded with an automated, understood. The seconds felt like hours. He paced the length of his sprawling villa, his mind replaying the scene on the beach. He had looked at Marcus and had seen only his own preconceived notions. He had judged a book by its cover, both literally and figuratively. He had seen a uniform and had dismissed the man within it, a man who possessed a depth of soul and a creative genius that Julian, with all his power and wealth, could never hope to possess. The irony was a bitter, nauseating taste in his mouth. His phone buzzed. It was Clara. The email contained a single line of text: Marcus Vance, Villa 14B. Julian's heart leaped. He had a location. He had an objective. He had to move. He left his villa not with his usual purposeful stride, but with a frantic, almost desperate energy. He ignored the resort staff, the perfectly manicured grounds, the other guests. His mind was a singular, focused laser: find Marcus Vance. He arrived at Villa 14B, a smaller, more modest dwelling nestled amidst a grove of swaying palms. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing in the stillness. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, a frantic, insistent rhythm. Still nothing. A cold dread began to set in. He felt a wave of frustration, but this time, it was directed solely at himself. He had come too late. He was about to turn away when a woman, a resort employee with a warm, kind face, approached him. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft and unassuming. "Yes," Julian said, his voice a strained whisper. "I'm looking for the guest in this villa. Marcus Vance. Do you know where he is?" The woman's eyes softened. "Mr. Vance? He checked out this morning, sir. An early departure. Said he had an emergency back home." Julian's world went dark. He felt as though the very ground had been yanked out from beneath him. He was a man who lived to solve problems, but this one was unsolvable. Marcus was gone. He had driven him away, not with a public display of anger, but with a cold, calculated act of dismissal. He had extinguished a man's peace, and now he was gone, a ghost in the perfect, pristine landscape. He thanked the woman, his voice hollow, and walked back to his villa, the weight of his failure a physical burden on his shoulders. He felt a profound, chilling emptiness, a void that no amount of wealth or power could ever hope to fill. The perfect island, once a stage for his triumph, was now a monument to his failure. He was alone, and he was consumed by a regret that was more potent and more painful than any he had ever known. He sat on his terrace, staring at the endless blue of the ocean, a symbol of a vastness he had been too arrogant to comprehend. He had a choice now. He could go back to his life, to his fortress of glass and steel, and pretend this never happened. Or he could face the truth of what he had become. For the first time in his life, he felt a genuine sense of humility, a painful, raw awakening. He had to find Marcus. He didn't know how or when, but he knew with an unshakable certainty that his journey was not over. It had just begun. He had to make this right, not for his company, not for his reputation, but for the soul of the man he had become. Julian's journey back to his villa was a forced march through a landscape that now felt alien and hostile. The vibrant colors of the resort seemed to mock his internal monochrome of despair. He had always believed in a universe of cause and effect, where every action had a predictable, calculable outcome. But the universe, in a poetic and brutal act of defiance, had proven him wrong. The single dismissive email he had sent had not only cost a man his job but had also severed a potential connection to a visionary, and in doing so, had irrevocably tainted his own carefully constructed world. He had come to the island to conquer, and instead, he had been humbled. He collapsed into a plush chair on his terrace, the endless blue of the ocean a stark contrast to the churning turmoil within him. He was Julian Thorne, CEO of Innovate Global, a man who built empires, but he had just dismantled a human life with a thoughtless, casual cruelty. The man he had seen as a symbol of laziness was in fact a symbol of quiet genius, of a life lived for art and passion rather than profit and power. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a buyout or a hostile takeover. This required something more. This required humanity. He knew that a quiet apology, a simple email of regret, would be a coward's way out. He had publicly, at least in his mind, judged a man for a perceived moral failing. The news of a janitor being fired for reading a book on the job would no doubt spread, if it hadn't already. The damage was done and it was public. The remedy, he realized with a sickening lurch, had to be public too. He had to use his platform not as a tool for self-aggrandizement, but as a megaphone for his own humility. With a newfound, desperate resolve, Julian pulled out his phone. He bypassed his assistant and his legal team, going straight to the head of his corporate communications. He was a man who, for the first time in his career, was not concerned with public perception. He was concerned with one man's perception, Marcus Vance. His team was shocked. Julian Thorne never acted on impulse, never risked his perfectly curated image without a dozen committees and 100 data points to back him up. Yet here he was bypassing all of it. He dictated a message, his voice a low, urgent hum. It was a single, concise command: prepare a live statement. I will be speaking in 30 minutes. Secure a broadcast on all major platforms. The content will be a personal apology. No pre-writing, no talking points. I'm going live. The response was a mixture of frantic questions and panicked protestations. Are you sure, sir? This could be a PR nightmare. We need to vet this. What if it's a trap? Julian ignored them. He wasn't doing this for his company's image. He was doing it for his soul. 30 minutes later, standing on a small, elevated platform in the resort's central pavilion, Julian Thorne, the ruthless CEO, was no more. In his place was a man, looking directly into the camera, stripped bare of his usual corporate armor. He wore a simple dark polo shirt, his hair slightly disheveled from his frantic search. The backdrop was the beautiful, unblemished blue of the ocean, a silent witness to his public confession. He began to speak, his voice clear but raw with a tremor of vulnerability he had never shown before. My name is Julian Thorne. I'm the CEO of Innovate Global. And I'm here to tell you that I made a grave mistake. He took a deep breath, the words now flowing, a torrent of long overdue truth. He spoke about his belief in efficiency, about the unforgiving nature of the corporate world he had built. He spoke of his encounter with a man he had judged, a man who, in Julian's blind arrogance, was an embodiment of everything he despised. He confessed to seeing the man on the 54th floor, to seeing him reading a book, to making a swift, brutal, and utterly wrong judgment. That man, Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, is Marcus Vance. And the book he was reading, the book that I saw as a symbol of idleness, was his own. The revelation was a punch to the gut for every person watching. He held up a copy of The Astral Mariner, a pristine new copy that he had just had a resort employee rush to him. This book, which I am told is a masterpiece of modern literature, was written by a man who worked for my company. He worked for my company because he had to. He wrote because he had to. He is a genius, a visionary, and I fired him for it. Julian's voice cracked with the weight of the moment. I did not see a man of letters. I saw a janitor. I did not see a brilliant mind. I saw a uniform, and I am ashamed. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes searching as if he could see Marcus through the lens. Mr. Vance, if you are watching this, I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am asking for an opportunity to speak with you. Not as your former CEO, but as a man who has just been taught the most important lesson of his life by a man I wrongly believed had nothing to teach me. I want to make this right. I want to learn. And I hope one day you might consider my sincere public apology. He concluded his statement with a final, unadorned plea for contact, leaving an open line of communication for Marcus. The live feed cut to black. The world, which had been transfixed by the CEO's raw, unscripted confession, erupted. News of the public apology spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of the CEO's humbling confession. Pundits dissected every word, every gesture. The story of the janitor, who was also a literary genius, was already a sensation, but Julian's public act had transformed it from a fascinating anecdote into a global phenomenon. Julian stood on the platform for a long time after the broadcast ended, the silence of the resort now a deafening roar in his mind. He had done all he could. The ball was now in Marcus's court. He had made himself vulnerable, and for the first time in his life, he felt a strange, unsettling peace. He had thrown himself on the mercy of a man he had wronged, and now, all he could do was wait. Marcus Vance's journey home was a blur. The small, peaceful island, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of exile. The moment Julian had walked away, the serene beauty of the beach had been replaced by a crushing weight of humiliation and uncertainty. He had been fired. Not with a letter or a formal meeting, but with a cold, public dismissal delivered by the very man who lived in the same building as his office. He had immediately packed his things, his quiet dignity giving way to a frantic need to escape. The trip, the solace, the small joy of his literary escape, all of it felt tainted. He had paid for this trip with his own hard-earned money, and the final, cruel irony of Julian's words, "A vacation my company has paid for," echoed in his mind, a constant sharp sting of a deeply unfair judgment. He was still in a daze when he arrived back at his apartment. The air, thick with the smell of the city, was a familiar comfort after the sterile perfection of the resort. He dropped his bag, the silence of his apartment a welcome balm to his rattled nerves. He was a man of routine and quiet rhythms, and the past few days had been a violent disruption to his very being. He went about his day with a kind of numb efficiency, making a pot of coffee, changing out of his travel clothes, and just existing in the familiar space. He had to figure out what to do. The income from his writing was steady, but it was not enough to support him without his salary as a janitor. He would have to find a new job. The thought was a weary weight on his soul. He was about to sit down to begin the grim process of updating his resume when his phone began to buzz with a relentless, frantic energy. It was his agent, an effervescent woman named Brenda who had discovered his work years ago. He ignored the calls. The last thing he wanted was to discuss the humiliating end of his employment with a woman who had come to see him as a symbol of literary success. He didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to be still, to process the injustice that had been dealt to him. But the calls didn't stop. They were followed by a series of frantic text messages. "Marcus, call me. Have you seen the news? This is insane." He didn't know what she was talking about. He hadn't turned on the television in days, and he had deliberately avoided social media during his trip. Finally, a text from his mother cut through the noise. "Son, are you okay? I just saw the news. He's a good man after all." Marcus felt a jolt of confusion. Good man? What was she talking about? With a sigh of resignation, he turned on the television. The first channel he landed on showed a replay of a news broadcast. A familiar face, but one he had never seen in such a state, filled the screen. Julian Thorne, the polished, ruthless CEO, stood on a makeshift stage at the resort, his face etched with a vulnerability that Marcus had never imagined possible. The man was speaking, and every word was a dagger to the heart of Julian's carefully constructed image. Marcus watched in stunned silence, his coffee going cold in his hands. He heard Julian confess to his arrogance, to his misjudgment, to the unforgivable mistake he had made. He heard him talk about the book, about the astral mariner. He heard him speak his own name, Marcus Vance, on a global stage. The sheer, unadulterated shock of it all was overwhelming. He had just been publicly shamed, and now, with the same breathtaking speed, he was being publicly vindicated. Julian Thorne, the man who had dismissed him with such cold authority, was now a worldwide spectacle of regret and remorse. The live broadcast ended, and the commentators took over, their voices a cacophony of speculation and analysis. They called it a stunning display of corporate humility, a PR masterclass in damage control, and the end of an era of corporate ruthlessness. Marcus heard the words, but they didn't penetrate. He wasn't a PR move. He was a man whose life had just been shattered and then, with a single, unexpected confession, reassembled in front of the world. He was the subject of a global conversation he never asked to be a part of. The quiet dignity of his life, the deep privacy of his work, had been ripped away. He felt a sudden, familiar anger. Not at Julian's apology, which seemed genuine enough, but at the sheer scale of the spectacle. Julian had used his power to fire him, and now he was using his power to apologize, to make it right on his terms. The apology was for the world, not for him. He wanted to be left alone, to be a quiet, anonymous writer again. He wanted his old life back, a life where his work as a janitor was a silent, unglamorous means to an end. But that life was gone, incinerated in the blinding light of this global news story. He ignored his phone, which was now ringing with a torrent of calls from reporters, publicists, and television producers. He didn't want to be a story. He just wanted to be a man who wrote stories. He was about to turn the television off when his phone buzzed with an email notification. It wasn't from his agent. It wasn't a news alert. It was a private email, a simple address, julianthorne@innovateglobal.com. The subject line was a single word, regret. Marcus opened the email. The message was concise, unadorned by any corporate flourish. It was a simple, raw message from one man to another. "Mr. Vance, I know you must be inundated with messages. I will not add to the noise. I am returning to the city tomorrow. I would like to speak with you. There are things I need to say that cannot be said in front of the world. My number is below. Please, if you can, give me a call. I will wait for as long as it takes." The email ended with his name and a number. Marcus stared at the screen, the words a quiet echo of the man's public confession. This wasn't a PR stunt. This was a man humbled and alone reaching out. The public apology had been for the world. This email was for him and him alone. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, Marcus felt a flicker of something other than anger and despair. He felt a sense of control. He had the power now. The ball was in his court. He looked at the phone number, his mind turning, and began to type a response. He would not be calling him, not yet. But he would be responding. Marcus Vance read Julian's email a second time, then a third. The word regret in the subject line seemed to hum with a quiet honesty that his public confession had lacked, not because it was insincere, but because it was a performance for the world. This email was for him. He thought about the man who had dismissed him so casually, the man who had looked at him and seen only a stereotype, a symbol of everything he believed was unproductive. And then he thought of the man on the television screen, stripped of his corporate armor, his voice raw with a vulnerability that had shocked the world. Julian Thorne had done the one thing that Marcus had never expected. He had made himself small. He didn't call the number. Instead, he typed a brief, measured response. Mr. Thorne, I appreciate the apology. My time is my own now. I'm not sure what there is to say that hasn't already been said. But if you'd like to speak, I'll be at the Daily Grind coffee shop on Elm Street at 11 a.m. tomorrow. He sent the email and felt a quiet satisfaction. The meeting would be on his terms, in his world, a world of local rhythms and simple comforts, far from the polished floors of Innovate Global. Julian arrived at the Daily Grind 20 minutes early. He was not in a suit. He wore dark jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt, a disguise that felt more like a costume than casual wear. He had never been to a place like this before. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and old books, the murmur of conversation a comfortable backdrop. People sat hunched over laptops and notebooks, their faces intent. He saw a microcosm of the very creativity he had so arrogantly dismissed. He felt a profound sense of unease, a man out of his element. He sat at a small wobbly table near the window and waited, his phone for the first time in years, turned completely off. When Marcus arrived, he found Julian staring out the window, his expression distant and preoccupied. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a lost man. Marcus walked over, a stack of freshly printed galleys for his next book tucked under his arm. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice calm and even. Julian looked up, and the relief in his eyes was so transparent and so raw that it took Marcus by surprise. He stood up, but he did not offer a handshake. Instead, he simply gestured to the empty chair. Marcus sat, and Julian took his seat opposite him. The small wooden table between them felt like a vast, uncrossable chasm. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He was a man who was used to giving commands, but now he was simply asking for something he couldn't take. "I don't know where to begin." "You already did," Marcus said, a small wry smile on his lips. "On national television." Julian winced. "I know it must have felt theatrical, a spectacle, but it was the only way I knew how to say it. And it was all true." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. "I saw you reading on my floor and I made a judgment. A swift, brutal, and completely wrong judgment. I saw a janitor who was wasting time and I chose to believe he was lazy. It was easier than believing he had a rich, internal life. It was easier than believing he was more than his job title." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I have spent my entire life believing that success is measured in efficiency, in productivity, in numbers. I built my empire on that belief. And with a single glance, you showed me how tragically and utterly wrong I was. You showed me that a man can work with his hands and still create a universe with his mind. You are the embodiment of a truth I've spent my life ignoring." Marcus listened, his expression unreadable. He felt a strange mix of emotions. The humiliation was still there, a ghost of a wound, but it was now overshadowed by a kind of quiet awe. This was not the man who had stood over him on the beach. This was a man broken by his own worldview, a man who had finally seen the limits of his own power. "The book you were reading," Julian continued, his voice now filled with a genuine, almost childlike curiosity. Was it really yours?" Marcus nodded, and a small, private smile touched his lips. "My latest. I like to reread them when they first come out, to see if they still hold up." Julian's eyes widened with a genuine admiration that had nothing to do with market value. I have read every word of it. All 3 books in the series. I couldn't put them down. You didn't just write a story, Marcus. You gave me a world. And you gave me a character who was an old man who spent his life sweeping up cosmic dust, and yet he was the most important person in the galaxy. I didn't realize at the time, but you were writing about yourself. You were writing about me too. The words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the beautiful, painful irony of the situation. Julian had come to apologize for his coldness, but he had ended up confessing his soul. Marcus finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. I don't want my job back, Julian. That life is over for me. I'm a writer now. That's what I am. But I appreciate the apology. And I believe you're being honest with me. Julian nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. He pulled out a checkbook. I know. This isn't about your job. I want to fund your next book. I want to build a foundation. A scholarship. Something that helps other people like you. People who have 2 lives, who are building their masterpieces in the quiet of the night. Marcus shook his head. No, Julian. I'm grateful, but no. The only thing I wanted from you was to be seen. You just did that. Everything else I will earn on my own. Julian looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a man not as an employee, not as an author, but as an equal. The story was over. The journey had ended. The CEO and the janitor had met in the middle, and in the space between a simple coffee shop table, they had found a common ground forged not from business, but from a shared, newfound respect for the quiet, hidden worlds that exist all around us. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.